The Roosevelt Hotel echoed with the clatter of streetcars that afternoon in New Orleans. But on July 30th, 1866, that same corner of the city held something very different. A government building called the Mechanics Institute, packed with men trying to finish what the Civil War had left unfinished. Outside, a crowd was gathering, and within hours, the streets around it would run with blood. By the end of that day, somewhere between 40 and 50 people lay dead, more than 150 wounded, almost all of them Black Americans, veterans, laborers, delegates who had come simply to talk about the future. It remains one of the deadliest single episodes of political violence in American history. And yet, ask most people today what happened in New Orleans in the summer of 1866, and you'll get silence. So here's the real question this story forces us to ask. How did one of the most consequential turning points of Reconstruction become one of the least remembered? To understand why that convention hall mattered enough to kill for, we have to go back 1 year, to a country that had just survived the war, but hadn't yet decided what peace actually meant. The Confederacy had surrendered. Slavery was dead, buried by the 13th Amendment. But freedom, it turned out, was a word nobody had agreed on the definition of. President Andrew Johnson inherited this moment after Lincoln's assassination, and he moved fast, in the wrong direction, many would soon argue. In May of 1865, he issued a sweeping amnesty, pardoning nearly every white Southerner who had taken up arms against the Union, and soon after, pardoning most of the rest individually, one by one. He let the old Confederate states rebuild their governments with almost no federal supervision. And who filled those new governments? Often the very men who had led secession in the first place. The result arrived quickly, and it was ugly. Restored Southern legislatures began passing what became known as black codes, laws that controlled where freed people could work, where they could travel, what rights they held in court. On paper, slavery was over. In practice, for millions of black Southerners, very little had changed. And in the North, people were starting to notice. Radical Republicans looked at these codes and drew a hard conclusion. Freedom without political power was just a word. If freedmen couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't shape the laws that governed them, then the war had ended. But the fight for the country's future hadn't even started. Nowhere was this fight sharper than in Louisiana. Back in 1864, under Lincoln's wartime plan to rebuild loyal state governments quickly, Louisiana Unionists had drafted a new constitution. It abolished slavery, a real and important step. But it stopped there. Black men still couldn't vote. Political power stayed in the hands of white Unionists and former slaveholders, the same class that had run the state before the war. After the surrender, ex-Confederates moved fast to reclaim what little ground they'd lost. Louisiana passed its own black codes. Voting rights tightened along racial lines. And in response, a coalition formed. Louisiana Republicans, black Union veterans, white Unionist allies, with one goal: reconvene that 1864 convention and amend it, this time to extend the vote to black men. Leading the push were men like former Governor Michael Hahn and Dr. Anthony Paul Dostie, a fierce abolitionist, unafraid to say plainly what was at stake. On July 27th, just 3 days before the massacre, roughly 200 black veterans gathered at the Mechanics Institute to rally support. It was peaceful, it was public, and to the white conservatives and former Confederates watching, it looked like something else entirely, an attempt, in their eyes, to hand the South over to the very people they had once enslaved. So on the morning of July 30th, the convention reconvened. Around 25 delegates took their seats inside the Mechanics Institute. Outside, a crowd had already formed, and this was not a curious crowd. Many were former Confederate soldiers, and they had not come to watch. Then came the marchers. Roughly 200 unarmed black supporters, most of them veterans, walked toward the building behind a band. A peaceful show of solidarity, nothing more. Bystanders began harassing them. Scuffles broke out. And then it stopped being scuffles. Sheriff Hayes arrived with a police force hastily deputized for the occasion, and instead of restoring order, they opened fire directly into the crowd. Mayor John T. Monroe, a man with clear Confederate sympathies, commanded a police force that didn't separate the mob from the violence. It became the violence. Some accounts describe fire sirens sounding just before the assault began, which raises an uncomfortable but important possibility. This wasn't spontaneous chaos. It may have been a signal, a plan. Marchers fled toward the Mechanics Institute for safety. The mob and the police followed them inside. Delegates tried to escape through windows. Reverend Jotham Horton, the convention's chaplain, was shot dead while waving a white handkerchief, a universal sign of surrender that offered him no protection at all. Dr. Dosty, the man who had helped organize the whole effort, was mortally wounded. A delegate named Victor LaCroix was killed. So was John Henderson, Jr., son of a sitting U.S. senator. A shoemaker named Lucien Kapla later testified to Congress about watching police fire indiscriminately into unarmed laborers and elderly men. His own young son was shot 4 times in the head and stabbed, and somehow survived, though he lost an eye. The violence lasted roughly 2 hours before Union General Absalom Baird finally declared martial law. When the official count came in, it recorded 38 killed and 146 wounded. Other historians, using broader evidence, placed the true toll closer to 50 dead and over 150 wounded. Nearly all of them were black. News of what happened traveled north fast, and it landed hard. Harper's Weekly refused to call it a riot. They called it, in their words, a work of massacre, pursued with a cowardly ferocity unsurpassed in the annals of crime. Congress sent investigators to New Orleans, and they interviewed nearly 200 witnesses, Lucien Kapla among them. Their conclusion was blunt. This had not been a spontaneous disturbance. Local authorities and former Confederates had orchestrated it. Combined with a similar massacre in Memphis just months earlier, New Orleans became undeniable proof, in the eyes of the North, that President Johnson's lenient approach to Reconstruction had failed. Not in theory, but in blood, in the streets, against people the federal government was supposed to protect. That November, voters delivered radical Republicans a veto-proof majority in Congress. And in 1867, that Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts, dividing the former Confederacy into military districts, demanding ratification of the 14th Amendment, and for the first time, extending the vote to black men across the South. The massacre in New Orleans didn't cause all of this alone, but it was one of the sparks that made lenient Reconstruction politically impossible to defend. Here's what makes this story matter, beyond the dates and the death toll. The New Orleans Massacre wasn't disorder. It wasn't a riot that spiraled out of control. It was an organized act, carried out with the cooperation of a city's own police force, designed to answer one question with violence instead of votes. Who gets to be a citizen in this country, and who gets to decide? Emancipation had answered one question. Slavery was over. But it left the far harder question wide open. Would freedom mean full citizenship, full political power, and actual voice in the government? Or would the old order simply reassert itself the moment federal attention drifted elsewhere? The men inside the Mechanics Institute weren't debating an abstraction. They were deciding, in real time, whether the Civil War's promise would survive the peace that followed it. And that's the bitter irony this story leaves us with. The battles of the Civil War are taught in every classroom in America. The New Orleans Massacre, a single afternoon of violence that helped rewrite federal policy and reshape the entire course of Reconstruction, is barely taught at all. The building where it happened is gone now, replaced by a hotel where guests walk past without knowing what once stood on that ground. Democracies, this story reminds us, aren't only undone on battlefields. Sometimes they're undone quietly, in the years after the shooting stops, by the violence nobody wrote down. If you want more of these deeply researched turning points from the Civil War and Reconstruction, the moments that shaped the country but never made it into the textbooks, subscribe and join me for the next chapter in this story.